entitled Boxwood Blight, Where Are We Now? The push to do this webinar actually came from you guys, the members. We began receiving calls and emails this past season about Boxwood Blight popping up in a variety of different areas surrounding the Chicagoland area. And this, of course, was on the heels of a horrific winter and spring for boxwoods as winter burns savaged this pretty popular plant material. But with blight, we're dealing with an entirely different type of disease, and its impact can be pretty widespread and devastating. As you all know, boxwood is a cornerstone plant in Midwestern design. It's not uncommon to find properties with hundreds of boxwoods that are planted in a single season. And so there's a lot to lose if or when blight is found on a property. So it's important that you as landscape professionals are prepared so that we can slow or stop this insidious fungal disease. So this morning we've gathered two individuals from the front lines. Dr. Jill Calabro is Research and Science Programs Director for the National Trade Association AmericanHort. Jill works out of their Washington, D.C. offices where she can be close to a variety of various regulatory agencies. And AmericanHort has been all over this topic for many years and has proactively and generously shared their research and expertise with a variety of state and local organizations, both governmental and non-governmental. And Jill is going to provide the scientific and national perspectives. Our second speaker is Scott Schirmer. Scott is the Nursery and Northern Field Office Section Manager for the Illinois Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Environmental Programs. He works out of the DeKalb Field Office, and Scott is going to approach this from a local perspective and discuss mitigation strategies. And I want to thank them both for assisting with today's webinar. And just a handful of housekeeping notes. You are going to be muted for the entire duration of the call. If you wish to ask a question, we just ask that you please use the question box. We're going to attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be put on our member download page after the webinar concludes. And there's also going to be some handouts and reference materials mentioned during today's presentation, and those can also be made available after the call. Today's webinar we expect to take no longer than about 50 minutes to 60 minutes, and we'll have everyone out of here as soon as that. So I want to thank you all again for joining us this morning, and now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Calabro. Jill?
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay, great. Let me get my presentation up and running. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. Yes, my name is Jill. I am with AmericanHort and HRI, which is the Horticultural Research Institute. We are the foundation of AmericanHort. Here's the kind of the outline of what I was thinking in terms of the presentation, my part here today, and I will try to keep my presentation to about 25 minutes or so. I talk pretty fast, and my slides are, I'm very slide heavy. I have a lot of them, so I'm sure I'll be able to get through them in my time. So first, I just want to give you just a very, very brief introduction to HRI. Believe me, I could probably spend 25 minutes just talking about HRI alone. I won't do that to you today because I know you want to learn about Boxwood Blight. So I want to go over a couple of general things about Boxwood Blight. Some of the basics is what I call it. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the cultivar testing and some of the other things that HRI has done to help provide the resource materials for the industry. And then I want to finish by talking about a couple of control options. So first, just a really brief introduction to HRI. The mission of HRI, well, let me back step just one tiny bit. HRI is a true nonprofit organization. We exist through an endowment. Every single dollar within our endowment has been given by industry members. We do not receive any funding from any federal dollars or any outside sourcing at all. It all comes from the industry. And our industry stakeholders consist of environmental horticulture. So primarily nursery and greenhouse production, but also landscape management and retail garden centers. And our mission is to really help improve the success of the industry. That's what we are meant to do. So to that end, we are heavily involved in boxwood blight, boxwood health in general. We've kind of sidestepped to talk more a little bit about boxwood health. So why boxwood? Why so much to do about boxwood. I love this picture. Number one, boxwood is deer resistant. I don't need to tell you all that, especially in Illinois. I grew up in Iowa. We have big deer, and we have a lot of them, and they are everywhere, and they destroy landscapes. I am in Maryland, and the deer here, much smaller, not nearly as nice looking, but they still destroy landscapes, except for boxwood, which are deer resistant. Other shrubs just do not meet this qualification. That's one of the big reasons boxwood is such an important thing to landscape and nursery production both. It's also a very versatile plant. You know, again, I don't need to tell you all this. It's in informal as well as formal garden situations. And it's been around, it's cited as going back to the early Egyptians, back to 4000 BC. The American Boxwood Society considers it to be the oldest garden ornamental. So boxwood is a big deal. Boxwood blight is also a very big deal. And boxwood blight kind of entered the US, or at least was detected for the first time in the US in fall of 2011, where it was found in a production nursery in North Carolina, and it was found in some landscape situations in Connecticut. Since then, it has been found in many other areas, including Illinois. Most of the researchers feel very confidently that if boxwood is present, boxwood blight probably is also present within the state somewhere. So it's probably a little bit more widespread than what's currently documented. There are a couple of exceptions, of course, being, I'm going to say maybe highly northern Minnesota, maybe a little bit exempt from boxwood blight, and then desert southwest areas where the humidity is just so low and what have you. So I digress. Back to boxwood blight specifically and how it pertains to your situation. The causal agent, I always put this information up. I am a plant pathologist by my training. I love talking about diseases and fungi, so this is not a dark and gloomy topic for me. I get excited to talk about it. We are lucky in the United States in that we only have one fungal causal agent, Calanectria pseudonaviculata. In Europe, they have two. They have the pseudonaviculata as well as Calanectria henricotia. So we do not want henricotia in the US. It has not been found here yet, and we do not want it. The pseudonaviculata and henricotia in Europe, can mate and create a super boxwood blight that is more resistant to fungicides and could be more of a serious disease problem. So hopefully that will never be detected here. So we're lucky in the US, we only have the one at this point. I want to talk a little bit about the epidemiology, or how boxwood blight is spread. The most important thing to note here is that the spores are very sticky. Some diseases like rust diseases and powdery mildews, those are wind-blown spores. They get blown all over the place, very easily moved. Boxwood blight, the spores are very sticky. So they're not as easily moved long distances unless they have help. So they're more likely to be moved short distances by like rain splash, wind-driven rain can move them, but they are moved by long distances, like I said, with helpers. Animals, such as deer, dogs, we've seen big hairy dogs in landscapes, move them around from shrub to shrub. Tools, workers, clothing, hoses, tires, footwear, you name it, the spores can stick to it and be moved around to a new location. So as landscape managers, that puts you at a very significant risk of moving the disease around. And so part of my job is to make you aware of some of these risks. And then also, of course, infected plant material, and that comes in part with a nursery trade, right? This disease can be transmitted on live and live as well as dead plant material, leaves, and this makes it very much a challenge. If you're removing a blight-infested shrub from a landscape, you got to make sure you get all of those leaves picked up, and so that they're contained, so that they're not spreading all around into new uninfected areas of the landscape. And then one of the areas that had never occurred to me is it moves around on floral sprigs too. So this time of the year, I was just over the weekend, we went and bought our Christmas tree, and there's all these boxwood wreaths and you know, sprays and different things throughout the the garden center, and I'm telling you what, I was over there just looking to see if I could find any Boxwood Blight. I didn't, which is good. But this is one way it's moved around. The state of Tennessee, that's how they have found it coming in from other areas, is on floral arrangements and wreaths and what have you. And because of that, they have enacted some regulations. They're one of the 2 states that have regulatory methods in place. And that's how it was also introduced into Indiana, or that's one theory. As maybe, I think it was 2 Christmases ago, there was a Boy Scout troop that made news headlines in Indiana that unfortunately was selling Boxwood Blight infected wreaths and what have you that they had received from North Carolina. So just be aware of that. So weather. How does weather impact this disease? It thrives in warm, wet weather. So the temperature ranges tend to be about 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when Boxwood Blight is in its prime, its happiest, when it's doing most of its growing, damage, infection, you name it. One good thing about this disease, it seems to go dormant in high heat. So it'll, ramp up in the spring, and then in the hot, high heat, 95 degree summer days, it tends to go dormant, and then it ramps back up again in the fall. And like I said, I'm in Maryland. We can see our temperature today is around the upper 40s. I could still find Boxwood Blight out there today if I looked hard enough. It's still doing a little bit out there in the upper 40s, low 50s too, just not as much. I do want to talk about microsclerotia. This is one form of the disease that it's just a bunch of spores, a fungal mass that comes together, and it's this hardened mass, and it's resistant to weather. And this is an overwintering strategy of the disease. So these microsclerotia survive in soil for many years, probably up to 5 years. I've heard one estimate at 8 years, but it depends on the conditions. In the more situations like in Illinois, where you have, usually adequate rain in most years, that extra moisture is beneficial to biocontrol microorganisms that will kill the microsclerotia a little faster. But they can survive for years in the soil. So that makes replanting a significant challenge. So alternate hosts, there are 2, Pachysandra and Sarcococca. I mention this because in the landscape, these 2 plants can serve as reservoirs for the disease. And as far as we know, these are the only 2 in the landscape, and that's a good thing. Nursery production of Pachysandra and Sarcococca do not look to be spreading Boxwood Blight, which is good. It just doesn't seem to occur in nursery production, at least on Pachysandra and Sarcococca. So I bring that up here today to this group just in case you're buying Pachysandra or Sarcococca from a nursery. You need to be less concerned about it having infection. But in landscapes, look there too. So scouting and detection. Want to go over that a little bit. I like showing this picture. I show it a lot in my Boxwood Blight presentations. This was a landscape I visited in the north of Baltimore a little bit. You look at this, if you're not looking very closely, you don't see the disease. If you start looking, you'll see it. And then when you start seeing it, it's rampant. So number 1, there's a little flag right there that I've highlighted with my little red circle there. That's a flag. You can see that little branch there on that shrub is completely defoliated, or mostly defoliated. That's a flag of Boxwood Blight. Then if you look in the lower canopy there towards the ground, you see a lot of defoliation down there. That is another really good sign for Boxwood Blight. Once we started looking in these, this whole planting is just hammered with Boxwood Blight. So scouting and detections. I think it's important to think about some of the other pests of Boxwood Boxwood and that can be confused with Boxwood Blight. And I think it's important to go over a few of those here today. So I have this picture here. The shrub on the left, I have a problem telling my left from my right, is a little bit smaller in stature. It's a little bit more compact. It's not quite as healthy as the one on the right. The difference here is the shrub on the left is infected with Phytophthora, a root rot disease. Okay, so that can be infecting boxwood. Phytophthora, however, won't cause distinct lesions on the leaf. It will eventually cause defoliation, but it'll start with just kind of slow growth and kind of unhappy, unhealthy, stressed looking plant. Okay, so that's one. This is probably the biggest one. I have calls periodically from landscape companies, and I've gone out with a few to different sites, mostly around Maryland, to take a look and see, is this boxwood blight in the landscape? So far, that has not happened where I found a positive boxwood blight, which is I'm happy about, but most of the time this is what I see, and that's leaf miner damage. So you can see, you know, it's got these little spots on the leaves, and you think, oh, it's, you know, it's got leaf spots. It's a boxwood blight. How you can tell leaf miner damage pretty quickly is if you see those lesions, you could take the leaf and split it longitudinally, split the top from the bottom. And then when you open it up, there's nothing in there. The leaf is essentially hollow because the little leaf miner larvae has gone in and just eaten all the internal parts of the leaves. So that's one way you could tell it's leaf miner damage, as opposed to boxwood blight. This is another disease on boxwood leaves that is pretty common and is also quite frequently confused with boxwood blight. This is a fungal disease called volutella. And the way you can tell it from boxwood blight is that it tends to have kind of a pinkish hue to it. It can be white, which can be confused with boxwood blight. And if you get yourself in this situation, you're not sure which it is, I always say just send it to a diagnostic lab, just to be sure. Be 100% clear. Know just in case. And this is boxwood blight. I chose this picture because I focused on the leaf. Those are the typical leaf symptoms of boxwood blight. You could see on the very leaf tip how it's black. So the infection probably started there and is working its way down the leaf towards the stem. If you look on that main stem too, you'll see some sporulation. You'll see some white sporulation. I know it's a little out of focus, but that's common as well with boxwood blight. You'll see some leaf lesions and leaf cankers and some of that sporulation. So that is what boxwood blight looks like. That is a pretty obvious sign. It's not always this severe. And I really want to drive that point home here today, because you guys in the landscape are on the front lines to protect boxwood in the landscape. This is an extremely severe infestation of boxwood blight on all of these shrubs. I mean, you can see there's a lot of defoliation there. There's a lot happening. These shrubs are half dead. And that's easy to spot. Here's another example. This is pretty easy to spot too. You look at this. This is similar to what that flag that I pointed out in that first picture about scouting. You can look here. Yeah, good. I got my circle on there too. You could see some black stem cankers and some black lesions on the stem there. That's boxwood blight. And then also, if you notice, that stem there is completely defoliated. Well, mostly defoliated. There's not a lot going on there in terms of leaves, and they're pretty unhealthy, the ones that are there. So that is a perfect example of a pretty severe boxwood blight infestation. And there's some more, another canker down there. This poor stem is riddled with it. However, like I said, it's not always this severe. And looking at this planting of boxwood is infected, but can you pick out the lesions? I know, you look and you see a couple leaves might have a little spots on them, and you see some kind of dried up leaves. That's not boxwood blight. That's just damage, just a physical damage there. The boxwood blight is there. If you look, you could see the little tiny light brown spots. That's the very early sign, the very early start of a boxwood blight infection. And this stem too, it's a little bit more obvious. You can see the cankers up and down there. But if you're just walking by and you see all that lush growth, you don't see any defoliation on this plant at all. So it probably wouldn't, you wouldn't stop to think, is there boxwood blight in there? You don't see any lesions on the stems, but you see the stem cankers. So that's easily overlooked too. So one of the things that HRI has done is we started an initiative. Well, actually, we restarted an initiative to do cultivar testing, to identify the cultivars that have the greatest tolerance and the greatest susceptibility, to help guide breeding, production, and then also landscape installations and management. Well, what we're finding is that leaf age definitely impacts susceptibility. There could be some fall recovery happening in some of the cultivars. So it's a really interesting situation, the different cultivars, how they behave. If you're looking at these two cultivars in this picture, I mean, you see a variegated cultivar over there on the far left, so there's more than two there, but this one here clearly is highly susceptible. I don't think anybody would argue that. And by the way, this is a site I visited in early March. So again, you can, I mean, it's, you can see it. It was a little bit active. There's a little snow over there. But anyway, so you can see the one circled in red there, that cultivar is highly susceptible, whereas this one is highly tolerant. There is no true resistance to boxwood blight. Please don't forget that. There is no true resistant. There is no cultivar that is 100% resistant. It just is not known to exist at this point. There may be some claims coming out here and there from different producers, but it just is not known to exist. Some cultivars are much more tolerant and much more resistant than others. Tennessee State has done a great job in pulling together, I think it's 5 or 6 different studies that have evaluated cultivars for their susceptibility and their tolerance. That's one of the resources that Scott mentioned at the very beginning. I've forwarded it on, so you can ask the folks there and to send that out to you so you can have it. It's a long publication. There's a lot of good information in there, but what I'm referencing are some charts towards the end that really break down a lot of the different cultivars. I've listed here just highly susceptible, susceptible, moderately susceptible, moderately tolerant, and some variable ones. It's interesting, the studies that have been done to date on cultivar susceptibility and tolerance, there has been very little standardization in terms of how the studies were conducted, where they were conducted, just even what they were measuring, even the size of the plant. So that's one of the things that HRI has done, is to, we've worked with a group of 8 researchers to develop a standardized protocol that moving forward, hopefully researchers will use when they're testing cultivars, so that we're all using the same protocol so that we can standardize and have a good idea of what's really tolerant, what's really resistant. Let's try to get rid of some of that variability that we're getting in these trials. Those trials have begun. Began in 2018, and then they occurred again this year. And this is what one of the trials looked like in process. This was up in Connecticut, Dr. Jim Lamondia, just what it looked like. Some of the cultivars tested, most of these were included. I'm not going to go through all those in the interest of time. If you would like to know more about that, please let me know. But you can see the differences among the cultivars. They're all jammed in there together, so they're all exposed to some serious inoculum and some serious disease potential, but they all are behaving very differently. So that's what we're measuring. And what we found is it's important to test in the spring and the fall, because again, that leaf age may impact susceptibility. And for example, if a cultivar is susceptible with, its young tender leaves in the spring, as it starts, to grow and harden through the summer and the fall, can it grow through the disease? It still may be infected, but can it still manage to just grow through it and grow out of it? That seems to be possible with some of these cultivars. If that's the case, how do you rate them? Do you rate them as tolerant or susceptible? It depends when you're looking at them. So these are some of the things we need to work out, and we have some expanded studies on tap to look at. Some of the preliminary results that I'm just sharing with you are here. Again, I don't want to go through these. I don't want to spend too much time on this. This information is available through me if you'd like it. I'm happy to share this particular chart with you and talk more about it. But again, please remember, this is preliminary data. It has not been considered repeated yet. We still need to consider additional environmental conditions and additional seasons. And there was another study conducted this fall, I think will strengthen some of that, but then there's another study that will be conducted next year that will really help us get to some more solid answers. I've talked about, the ability of a plant to outgrow the disease. And then the other factor, you could see a leaf spot, but is it sporulating? So if it's not sporulating, then it's not active, so it's not spreading. How do you rate that? Is that susceptible or is that tolerant? I don't know. So we have to resolve some of these issues. And there's just another one. Now, I put this one in there to show it can grow through it, because you can see, I hope you can see my little cursor there. There's a stem right in the middle. It's got a nice big brown canker, and then some lush growth on the top of that. So it's this cultivar is trying to grow through it. So one of the other things HRI has done, we developed some BMPs for production 2 years ago. And then earlier this year, back in September, we held a webinar, and we determined that stakeholders would like us to develop some best management practices for the landscape community as well. Those are in process now. I think I've got a really good solid draft of what those BMPs are going to look like. We just need to worry about creating the introductory materials and incorporating it into the production BMPs. And so we'll be releasing that probably next month or early next year there. So I'm going to go through some of the control strategies with just the last couple minutes here. And number one is sanitation. Sanitation is so important. Disposable booties and coveralls are your best friend in working with boxwood. And I'm just saying boxwood in general, just in case you've got an infection and you don't know it. Also, disinfestation is important too. Disinfest your tools, boots, and tires. I know it's a pain, between blocks especially if you know you have an infected plant on site. One of the good things that research has shown is that 70% alcohol is effective in just a matter of seconds, and it kills all spore stages, even those microsclerotia that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So ethanol is cheap, it's easy to use, and it works within seconds. So ethanol is a good one. 70% is perfect. The other ones can work too. Bleach, Lysol, and Xerotol. I don't mean to diminish them, but anyway. All right, sanitation. Let's see, we've got over that. Also, removal of the infected material. I've talked about how difficult that can be. We recommend double bagging an infected plant. We recommend the infected plants be burned or buried at least 10 inches. If they're bagged, double bagged, or they can be disposed of in a landfill incinerator if your local laws permit that. Most importantly, do not compost. Please do not compost infected material. It looks as though, at least at this time, researchers are recommending and sticking with this do not compost. And that is because there is so much variability and inconsistencies in composting processes. If it's not done properly, the disease will not die. So at this point, please do not compost. This is what a burn pile can look like. That was a production site. Mulch. Mulch is really great, actually. Just a hardwood mulch, doesn't matter which kind, just 1 to 3 inches, your normal mulching depth that you're doing out there already, really does a great job in preventing rain splash and protects the understory of boxwood. And it changes the microbiome too. So just remove any infected material, cover all areas that could be contaminated with mulch. And it's great for landscapes. This is a site I visited in North Carolina. This planting here, the cultivar is unknown, but it was infected with Boxwood Blight. And what they have done is they've pruned up the bottom, put in mulch, and they thin out strategically to create better airflow within that planting. And I was there with a group of researchers. Nobody could find any signs or symptoms of Boxwood Blight at all. So they're managing it, and the mulch is helping. And lastly, I will end with a list of fungicides that I know are labeled and can be used. And these are only used preventively. No fungicide will cure a plant. It doesn't work that way in plants. People, yeah, we could take antibiotics and be cured of our problems. It doesn't work that way with plants and fungicides. Chlorothalonil is great. Chlorothalonil plus T-methyl, sold as Spectro by New Farm, is really good. Fludioxonil, this label is coming very shortly. It should be here by the springtime at the very latest. I know it's been applied and it will be approved. Orchestra, or fluxapyroxate plus pyraclostrobin, it's premix combination. This is an on-patent product, so it tends to be a little higher on price, but it works. These bottom three, metconazole, propiconazole, and tebuconazole, are all the same mode of action. They're all DMIs, and they are all extremely effective. I would say metconazole or Tourney and tebuconazole or Tort probably have higher effectivity than Banner, but Danner, of course, is the cheapest. So that is where I will end. I will turn it back over and let Scott get started. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Just a reminder to hold your questions till the end of the webinar. If you want to submit a question through the chat for Jill, we can go ahead and take those. And right now, I am going to turn it over to Scott Schirmer so that he can give you some of the local aspects of the Boxwood Blight.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Scott and Anne-Marie for having me on. Thanks for everybody attending. Again, I'm Scott Schirmer. I'm with the Department of Agriculture, and I'm going to kind of give a quick update on Boxwood Blight and the status and what we've seen in Illinois, and then some management options to kind of touch on what Jill mentioned as well, and then a little bit of a promising research project that we were involved with. So, oops, and it's not going forward for me. Here we go. Okay. So interestingly enough, you've probably seen enough of the Boxwood Blight photographs, but that picture in the middle is kind of our patient 0 up in Winnetka. So that was the first location that we found in Illinois. So briefly, we first detected it back in 2016 in November in a residential landscape. Like I mentioned, it was up in the Winnetka area. 2 more came in December of that year. One was residential, and then one was, interestingly enough, a production or landscape greenhouse facility. So that's when it kind of became apparent that things were blowing up. We had detections in both the residential setting as well as production. So another confirmation came in January of 2017, and this kind of prompted a quick response from us. So we put in a nuisance declaration in April of 2017 with support from the Illinois Green Industry Association, and this basically gave us the authorities to regulate and work on eradication of this pest as it was found. So our first confirmation within a dealer setting was in September, and then another one in June at the same facility but different holding yard. So this kind of gave us somewhat the trifecta. So everything, we had found it in everything except an actual Boxwood Blight growing nursery at this point. So all detections had been voluntarily abated. So everyone was very cooperative with getting rid of this within the setting. But October 2018, we had a detection that really changed things and kind of hinted that this was going to be a much bigger problem and potentially a very expensive problem. Then shortly thereafter in November, we had another detection. So here's some stats or figures, and hopefully these will demonstrate what I was just discussing. And if you can see my mouse here, the previous detections were all 60, 12, 20, 10, 50 plants, something like that. That October find was 25 plants, but we're looking at 250 in total on the property. And then that November 2018 find was about 80 plants, but 400 to 500 plants on that property. And if you look over here, additionally, this is the column with regards to recent additions of host material. And both of these had not had any additions within the last 5-8 years. Previously, there were some. So that was pretty easy to attribute to where it was introduced. As Jill said, oftentimes it's going to be in new plants introduced to the landscape or potential equipment, and of course wildlife comes into play. But these two were really kind of bizarre in the sense that nothing new had been included or introduced over the previous 5 or 8 years. And then just down below, you'll see some of the recent activity we had. As Jill said, it kind of goes into dormancy during the hot time of the year. And so it seems like if you look at these time frames, we do get most of our reports in the fall, winter time, or early in the year as well. So not much activity over the summer. Just some of the species that we're aware of that we were able to identify as being the infected ones on the properties. And then additionally, a lot of the stuff that we end up having to do is trace forward and trace back. So these are some of the states that we've identified some of the material coming from. And of course, oftentimes it's very difficult, especially when the plants have been in the landscape for years, to actually try and backtrack to find out where that came from. So here's just a photo. Again, more pictures. This is the first one that we found in a production site. So again, they were very cooperative. They ended up destroying 4,300 of the 22,000 plants. So getting back to this October 2018 detection, again, a very high-end property up on the lake shore in northern Cook County or southern Lake County, I can't quite recall. Approximately 100 boxwoods in the front yard where the detection was found, and then an additional 150 in the back on a very well manicured patio area that looked over Lake Michigan. So, you know, when we're talking about, a lot of people like to compare these invasives to emerald ash borer, and when you look at emerald ash borer, you know, the cost to remove a tree was $1,000, $2,000, maybe 3 or 4 on the high end, and a lot of people only had 1 or 2 trees on their property. So when you're talking about the significance of this pest, you know, looking at a $50,000 job to remove and replace, and just in that front area alone, and then a potentially $100,000 project when you look at everything on the property. The homeowners were in their 70s, so there were sentimental values coming into play. They didn't want to lose the uniformity and aesthetics during their lifetime. So that was when we breached the idea of management options, and you know, pun intended at the bottom, as Jill said, it's a sticky pathogen. So this became a sticky situation to some extent. So as mentioned, North Carolina is one of the leaders in this field, as well as Virginia. So you see, I'm the state plant regulatory official here in Illinois, so I contacted my counterparts in Virginia and North Carolina, as well as some Virginia and North Carolina pathologists for their technical input. So the overwhelming approach or recommendation was to focus the regulatory enforcement on production, which ultimately leads to further distribution, because complete control within private property is nearly impossible. You know, as we mentioned, you're going to have kids running around that can transfer it, pets, wildlife. So you really kind of have to look at managing or regulating what you can. So this point right here, offer management as an option in the landscape and aim to manage whatever can be controlled through human activities was kind of the approach. So we developed some outreach materials with U of I. So we have those available. The October detection, they did opt for that management. However, that November detection did not. So moving forward, we only have just a handful of properties that have decided to try management. And then again, as Jill said, it's always the recommendation to remove and destroy infected or symptomatic plants and not replant with susceptible plants, because that's the only way you're going to be able to guarantee it to not be in the property or the landscape, or to actually thoroughly remove it. So those management options that we devised in conjunction with Virginia and North Carolina are here. I have provided these to Scott and Anne Marie, so this is something that would be available for you if needed. And I broke it down. It's one document, but this is the one that's actually looking to prevent the spread within the property. So again, we're looking at things like changing the pruning timing, changing pruning strategy, artificial irrigation timing, as Jill had mentioned, along the lines with mulch, sanitizing equipment between hedgerows, and beginning a treatment schedule. This one down here, number 13, again, it's broken up because I broke this down into 2 different approaches, as you'll see. But then minimizing the exposure of temporary or seasonal boxwood. So as we find these high-end properties, we see that there's a lot more movement of temporary or seasonal plants that come into play. So try and consider those being a potential source for introduction to the property or escape from the property for the pathogen. And then these are the ones designed to prevent the spread from the property. So in an ideal world, designate equipment to be used only on the property and leave it or store there whenever possible. I think that makes sense, but it's not always possible. Contain exposed protective gear, and generally sanitize when leaving. Try to ensure the property is the last visit of the day. So if it's the first, then you're potentially carrying things with you and leaving it along the way, so to speak. Destroy or abate any boxwood debris. This is very similar to what Jill mentioned. You know, leaves, twigs, anything like that should be considered infected. Sanitize and wash your gear. And then again, with the temporary or seasonal, like I mentioned earlier, anything that's brought onto a property, especially if it's known to be infested and there's management going on, anything that comes on and ends up leaving should be considered or treated to be potentially infested or infected, excuse me. So the promising research that I mentioned, we were working with Dr. Hong at Virginia Tech on soil viability studies, and Jill touched on this a little bit too. So our first detection site in Illinois was selected based on the necessary criteria, and that was basically to be confirmed positive, have the plants removed, and basically nothing else done. So nothing would have been done to alter or change the presence of the pathogen within that soil. So we worked for 3 years and did 4 replicate soil samples, collected May, June, and then again November to kind of evaluate how the seasonal cold and seasonal hot had impacted the pathogen. And this is a message or memo that we got from Dr. Hong. So great news, all 4 replicate samples were negative for this year, so Illinois was included in that. So it's looking like maybe 3 to 4 years, and again, preliminary results, and this hasn't been formalized yet, but preliminary results are showing that potentially 3 to 4 years would be the time frame that you could safely replant boxwood. But again, I think that's something that may be an approach of better cautionary, maybe give it an extra year or two to be sure. But that's where we're at right now. So as far as potential for replanting, that's kind of the big question. As you lose these, you kind of want uniformity in the landscape. There is that potential for replanting in the near future. So with that, I will conclude and basically offer it up to questions, or Jill or I guess.
This is Scott Grams again from the ILCA. I just want to thank Jill and Scott for lending us their time this morning. We are going to open it up to questions for a few minutes. If you would like to use the chat log, if you want to enter your question there, Jill and Scott have agreed to answer any questions that may arise. So we'll just wait a minute or two, and then if there are none, we'll let everybody go.
I just want to add, this is Jill, sorry, real quick, just to let everybody know, in Europe, this is considered a non-issue. Boxwood blight is everywhere now throughout Europe. All of the European countries have it. It's everywhere. They just treat it with fungicides. They haven't stopped planting it. It's still present within the landscape. But, of course, the environmental conditions are a little bit different there than here. So and I think, we're still in the stage of the disease is still spreading. We're still finding it in places we didn't know it was. So I think we're still in a stage of trying to manage and not freak out. But over in the EU, it's just considered, it's just there.
Jill, this is Scott, and kind of just dovetailing into that, I think part of the issue is that they also have boxwood as an understory in their forest, so we don't have anything along those lines that could harbor it in a natural area, so they probably have a much larger scope when you're talking about landscape versus natural areas.
We do have a few questions. The first is, what time of year do you recommend for preventative spraying?
I would say early spring. When you start seeing new growth, when you've got those young tender leaves coming, you want to protect those. I think that's probably the most critical time. I think you can back off the sprays in the summer when the high heat and humidity are hitting there. And then there's a good, depending on the cultivar, you should probably resume sprays again in the fall. Scott, would you agree with that?
I would concur, yes.
We have another question. If a hedge has boxwood blight and it is removed, is it safe to replant boxwood, or should the soil be removed and replaced before replanting?
That's a really great question. I have seen the one pictures I showed from the box I mentioned was the Baltimore landscape. They've replanted at least twice. They are also working with Dr. Hong. He has been up to visit the site and is working with them on ways to minimize it. They are just, it's a historic home, and boxwood is what they want. they are replanting, and they're going forward by using the mulch. They're picking different varieties that are more tolerant. They're making sure they're buying from nurseries that are clean, certified clean, and continuing to use preventive sprays. But they also have a caretaker on staff who takes care of all these things. And he actually goes out there and vacuums up leaves with a shop vac. So I think it is possible, but maybe not in all situations. I think it's going to be so situationally dependent. I wish it was an easy answer.
Another question is, what is the humidity level for boxwood blight infestation?
Well, that's a good question too. I don't know the exact humidity levels. Generally, I would say probably 80% above is ideal. But even in lower humidities, you know, boxwood blight occurs in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, where humidity is typically much lower. And then you also have to consider the fact that a boxwood plant itself, the shrub itself, has a different microclimate within the plant. The humidity within the plant, within the canopy, is different than the ambient humidity of the world.
I will add that a lot of the reports, and I don't think I pointed it out, but a lot of the reports that we've received, in fact, all of them on the residential side of it, have come from landscape contractors or non-residents. And a lot of the comments that we receive were that the home, excuse me, the homeowner is an overwaterer, or it's in a courtyard where there's poor air circulation. So it seems like some of the homeowner, cultural tendencies also contribute to this when given the opportunity. So again, overwatering, over irrigating seems to be a common theme with the reports that we've received.
And even heavy tree cover, right? I mean, if you have a lot of heavy tree cover and branches and what have you, that's going to slow air movement and
right.
Yeah.
We're just going to do the final three questions here. What are some recommended alternative shrubs that can be used instead of boxwoods?
Ilex is the big one that I hear. A lot of folks are turning to Ilex, but you know, Ilex has its problems of its own. That's one of them.
If you do need to remove soil, to what depth should soil be removed?
I don't think there's been any solid recommendation that's been developed for that. I would say probably 6 inches. And it's going to depend on the situation too. Just if it shouldn't be more than 6 inches for sure, just because leaves would just be falling. Boxwood blight doesn't look to be infecting roots, but the leaves that would drop and then over time would, settle down into the soil, or it could get washed into the soil, I guess, too. Now that I think about it, I would probably recommend 6 inches.
Do you recommend preventative spraying on every site or just sites that show symptoms?
We talked about that last week in developing our the BMPs that we've got for landscape management. I would definitely not recommend for every site, just because that's a lot of fungicide use. If you've got a site where you have a plant that was infected, then definitely I would treat on property where you've got one plant infected or had been found. But if you have high value historic plantings, yeah, you probably do want to protect them, even if there's not been any infection found, no hits there.
Do we have time for one more? It is,
I'm fine.
did the harsh winter last year weaken the boxwood and make them more susceptible?
It's possible. It's just with boxwood blight, it's one of those diseases that's capable of infecting healthy plants. There are some diseases like anthracnose, for example. It's a weak pathogen. If the plant is weak, then it causes a lot more damage. Phytophthora is another one of those. There are certain strains of Phytophthora, but I don't think that would have been too much of a contributing factor. I think it's going to be more of a factor of moving around, spreading within the nursery trade, spreading by landscape managers and deer potentially too, and dogs. Seen a lot of that.
Well, on behalf of the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association, I want to thank Jill and Scott for their time and expertise this morning. We're going to close the webinar now. As mentioned, give us about a day and we'll be posting this to our member download site, and we also will be sharing any reference documents or materials that were referenced during the call today. So thank you again, Jill and Scott, and good luck out there, everyone.
Thank you.